So good to be back for the 2017 Marie Northrop Lecture Series. Thank you for coming to our inaugural lecture. I'd like to thank the LAPL for making the Mark Taper Auditorium available to us, and to the History Department and the Special Programs, Russell Pyle, working the controls here for us, for all the help LAPL gives us. And if you like this program, I'd like to encourage you all. I hope most of you are members of the Historical Society, but these are the kinds of activities we like to put on for our members, and if you'd like to support that, please consider joining the organization. Afterwards, we'll have some light refreshments and maybe the chance to talk to some of the producers. Stick around for that. And of course, there's a panel discussion following the film. So now let me introduce the chair of the Marie Northrop Lecture Series Committee, Michael Holland, who's putting this on today, and he's going to tell you about the program.
Thank you, Todd. Hey, it's nice to see everybody out here today. I've heard that there's construction, all sorts of blockages out on the streets out here, so God bless you for being able to make it here. And hopefully there'll be a few others coming in before the panel starts. And that's actually going to be the fun part for me. This is a presentation I've been wanting to do for a while, and so I'm grateful that we've got the panel assembled today that we have, and I know you're going to love them. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and screen Bridging the Divide, Tom Bradley and the Politics of Race first, so we'll get that screen, because that will actually set up the context for the presentation that we're going to be having out here on the stage, where there'll be basically some Q&A between the 4 or 5 of us, and then we'll open the floor up to discussion, and so you will be also have the opportunity to have your questions asked and answered as well. And so I hope you'll participate, with us as we go through the afternoon. I will save the introductions for the panelists until after the screening, because we are starting a little late, and I would like to kind of make up a little bit of lost time as best we can. So if you are all ready to sit back and learn a little bit more about the city of Los Angeles and its favorite son, Mayor Tom Bradley, let's go. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Now that we are ready to start our Q&A, let me introduce our panel to you in very short order. To my immediate left, your right, there's Lynn Goldfarb. And Lynn is an Academy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker specializing in historical and social issue films. And then to her left, your far right, would be Allison Sotomayor, her production partner. And Allison is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker specializing in historical, social issue, and media advocacy films. On the other side of the panel, to my right, your left, is Wanda Moore, who you saw in the film. And Wanda Moore joined Councilman Bradley's staff in 1971.
I think so.
And,
I was there for 22 years.
and from 1973 to 1993, she was his executive assistant during his time as mayor. So I would think it's fair to say that you were his gatekeeper.
I was.
All right. And my far right, your left, former Councilman Robert Farrell, who prior to representing the 8th District was a journalist for the California Eagle and the Sentinel. Yes. And prior to that, you were also a freedom writer, were you not? All right. And so, all right. And, my other. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the film itself. Now, actually, Lynn, if I understand it correctly, what inspired making this film, and you've actually made it twice for two different audiences, but what inspired you to make the film at all was that you had put Tom Bradley's story in capsule form in another documentary that the two of you had made called A New Los Angeles.
Yes, that's correct. So we made a documentary called The New Los Angeles, and it looked at the transformation of LA from the 70s to the election of Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. And in the process of making that film, which was shown on PBS, we realized that Tom Bradley's story was at the heart of the change in Los Angeles, and that nobody was telling that story. And I think that we were most surprised, because we wanted to use just a few minutes. I think there's 6 minutes or 7 minutes in the film on Tom Bradley. We said, oh, we'll just go to the archives, or we'll, find a documentary that's been made about him, and we'll be able to research it. And we realized that no film had ever been made, nor, had a book, actually, a scholarly biography been made. So we were interested in telling the story. We, both Allison and I grew up in LA, and we felt the story was so important, and we kept thinking somebody else is going to do this. And in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, and we knew that Tom Bradley had laid the foundation for that election, we said, this is the time we have to tell this story. And then Allison and I got together to make the Bridging the Divide.
I just want to say first, before I answer that question as well, Michael, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. We're really honored. Thank you to the LA Historical Society and for the History Department here at the Central Library. And I just want to point out, Michael Holland and Todd Godowski at the LA City Archives, if it wasn't for them and their assistance throughout the 7-year journey for Lynn and I to have put this story together, we could never have done the film that we did without their help. I mean, they helped with visual and content research. So thank you very much for your assistance. We couldn't have done it without you. So just wanted to throw that out there. When we started the journey in 2008, it was very interesting because we were so surprised to find out that there was no scholarly biography done on Mayor Tom Bradley. So we had to embark on an enormous amount of research on our own. And at that time, we found out that schools were not teaching Tom Bradley's life and legacy. In fact, he was practically omitted from our history books. And so we felt that his life and his legacy was being marginalized. And so we set out at that point in 2008 to really prove to the nation and to the world that Tom Bradley was historically significant. So that was kind of one of the big reasons why we embarked on this journey to do this film.
But again, you've actually got two different films. One for the high school history curriculum, and then the one we just saw, which was more for general public consumption. And so what's the main difference between those two films?
Well, I think the biggest difference I'll just back up for a moment on the story behind that. When we started the film in 2008, and we said this is going to be a great time to make this film when Obama was elected president, we had no idea how hard it was going to be to actually raise the money to complete the film, and that's why it took us. One of the reasons it took us 7 years, and at a point when we weren't quite sure whether we would actually get the money to finish the film, because we were waiting for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which we ultimately got. But we said that the most important thing now is to make sure we have a film that can be used in schools. So we actually stopped making this film and made a film called Tom Bradley's Impossible Dream, and worked with LAUSD curriculum designers to make a film that could be used in 11th grade history and 12th grade government classes. And then in the middle of making that, then we received the grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we went from one film to the other, and it was a little bit crazy because usually you make the educational version after, you take it from the main film, and we ended up making two completely different films. I think the difference is that the one for high schools is a little bit shorter, and it deals with a little bit more local history, and it doesn't have as much of the police brutality in it that this one has, so it's toned down a little bit, although it definitely tells the story of the, civil unrest in '92.
But yeah, we felt it very strongly to do a second film just for educational use, because the next generation of young people need role models, for one. This is a very inspiring story for that. But two, they also have to wrestle with the question about race. And, we have shown this film to, at this point, about 50 or 55 community screenings, and we've talked to a number of different people and younger generations too, and many times we've heard from young people saying this is really the first time we have had the opportunity to talk about race amongst ourselves, amongst other people, amongst students of different races, and this film gives them the opportunity to do that. So we wanted, and we very much, we're committed to making a film just for students.
Okay, Ms. Moore. So, 1973, he decides to run. What do you think do you think he had it in him to do it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. First of all, let me.
Okay. Oh, to get your mic.
Sorry. First of all, I started working for the city of Los Angeles, and they gave me 35 years there, okay? And I worked for 22 years for Tom Bradley's office, for Mr. Bradley. Fortunately, I had those earlier years before I got to his office, because no one tells you anything or how to do things. If you don't do it on your own, you're a dead cat. It was wonderful, because when I went to work for Tom Bradley, I had already been at City Hall for, I don't know how many months, years, I should say. But my first step there, no one said hello to me. That was my first morning. It was like 8 o'clock in the morning, and I realized that there weren't too many people who came into the office at 8 o'clock in the morning. But at that particular time, and no one gave a word to help. You were on your own. So if I hadn't had the experience with the other officers, the other office, the city itself, I wouldn't be here today with you good, great people. Tom Bradley was wonderful. And he was one of those, when he first saw me, he was walking by. I walked into the office, and I'm looking at this desk, and all this papers on this desk, and I'm saying, whoa. And he walks by, and he said, "Good morning." And I said, "Good morning, sir." And he said, "Why are you just standing there?" I said, "I'm trying to figure out who's supposed to be over there." And he said, "That's for you," and just kept on going. So if I didn't know what I knew, I wouldn't be here today. Tom Bradley was an excellent keeper, I would say, worker. I mean, you didn't have an 8 to 5, did you, Bob? It was an experience. It's so much one could say about Tom Bradley and how he was with people. I can recall there were people who would come into the office. You didn't have to have a time to get there. If you come and just walk in and say, I want to see the mayor, I want to see Tom. And they have a seat and bring boss of someone here to see you, and they go in. Tom Bradley, I've seen him when he would have these people who were telling and sharing with him the life they were having, which was very hard and difficult. And it was nothing for him to put his hand in his pocket and pull out money to give them when they said they were hungry and they were. It was an experience. You worked. You didn't have an 8-hour job. You had an all-night job, and you didn't mind. And you would be told, I think you should go home now. I think you should go home now. But I don't know where to begin. I mean, there's so much to say.
Okay. Let me help a little bit with that. Now, you've got some of the DVDs out front
Yes.
for sale.
Yes.
For $20?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mention that because in addition to the film itself, there's a lot of extra peripheral material, including lots of little interview segments that they couldn't use. And you are in one of those as well. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the mayor coming in on weekends.
Every day.
Basically his weekend routine, such as it was, fully dressed in the suit and with the music on and all that. But also someone else in the peripherals brings up the idea of area days. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Would you explain what that was? And Bob, I think you probably experienced that a little bit more directly. So who wants to unpack that a little bit?
Well, area days that the mayor came up with meant that you didn't have to have an appointment with the mayor. And you had this day that would be in the news that anybody who wanted to come in and talk with him about anything could do so without an appointment. That office, you had people line up down the hall. They came, and he did what he said he would do. He met with everyone who came into that office, gave them at least 15 to 20, maybe an hour meeting with him. And if they had most problems not having money, Tom Bradley would reach into his pocket and give them money to eat. And they would say, oh, no, no. He said, yes, yes, yes. And they would leave. That's how he was.
Now, would this be in the mayor's office in City Hall, or would this be in the district offices all around the city?
No, sugar, it would be in the mayor's office. They came to see the mayor, and they would sit outside. That's right. They would sit outside and wait as long as they had to wait, as long as he said they could come in and talk with him. And they did, and he did. And he made a difference in their lives. He made people know that they were welcome, that this was their city as well as his city. Don't get me started. Don't get me started. It was just wonderful to have someone to care so much and could see it and just, pick up the telephone to try to find a job, and they're sitting there, blah, blah, blah. I'm sending someone over to you. That was Tom Bradley.
And he answered his own phone quite often, didn't he?
Always. Not only did he answer his phone, he made his own phone calls. He wouldn't call the secretary or somebody and say, call so-and-so for me. He would pick up that phone and make that phone call. He never had any staff member to make calls for him. That was his job, he said. Bob, talk.
No, it's important that you share this insight because people have a perception of as public elected officials being distant people and caricatures of themselves. And Tom Bradley was the real deal.
He was.
And when people had an opportunity to touch him, to shake his hand, to be around him, smiles would come out. People would look up and really admire this man. Just want to get close enough touched the hem of his garment. Oh,
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. He really did. And this was in his office.
Yes.
And that made them feel so good because he would come from behind the table and sit next to them to have this conversation and do whatever. He would go into his pocket and give them money to go pay their bill. Tom Bradley was just special. He was very special.
Okay, Bob, I'm going to ask you something that we were talking about a little bit earlier this afternoon. Nelson Mandela comes to Los Angeles, June 1990. Comes here, he makes his speech on the steps of City Hall. The mayor makes his speech. Ferraro, council president, makes his remarks. And he said something in his remarks about you specifically. And that was that you were talking about apartheid and the need to divest before anyone else in the council or anyone else in City Hall knew what that was. Now, you also told me that Tom was an early adopter of that. So how'd you describe that particular process that eventually led to divestiture?
Well, first off, I'd like to just say how proud I was and how proud I am that Tom Bradley was one of my sponsors. He was the man who made it possible for me to run for public office. He supported me for those 4 terms that I was there. Before that, I was on his staff as an area representative. And before that, his key aide, Maury Wiener, interviewed me and brought me aboard the Tom Bradley political operation both in 1969 and in 1973 to do the community organizing in South Los Angeles. So I was honored to be around a man who, I think I first learned about Tom Bradley when I was still at UCLA as a community activist, a police officer leader in South Los Angeles, involved at the Avalon Carver Community Center, which is a key historic spot in terms of social activism and community activism in South Los Angeles. And to be part of his team was really great. And on that specific instant, I'd just like to say that Tom Bradley, in many ways, was a cautious man in the way he carried himself, because Tom Bradley projected himself, and he was a person for all Los Angeles. But the reality was, and Tom Bradley referenced the Negro situation, and he was proud of his heritage, and he was aware of everything that was going on. I think that's why I had the opportunity to, relative to my peers, as I came out of UCLA, and I chose to get involved in the civil rights movement, to be on a freedom ride, go down south, go to jail, all that kind of stuff, and come back and want to be active in my community. He was sensitive to that. And then the fraternity ties, he was sensitive to that. So as you consider the times and you would look at Tom Bradley, you would not necessarily think that he was attuned to what was happening in Black America, with that emphasis shifting from the use of the term Negro to Black America and what was happening around the world to people of African heritage. And among the things that were going on were the expectations of people abroad to run their own countries, to control their own destinies. And Tom Bradley was aware of and supportive of those activities. But given the dynamics of politics in Los Angeles, Tom Bradley was not necessarily the first person to be out there and speak and talk about it. That's a role that I, among others, played, because he was a Black mayor of a major American city, and to not have a presence of things that were sensitive in what was going on south of our border with people who were doing dynamic things, seeking change, whether it was in Central America around Belize, or whether it was over in the South American continent, whether it was in the Caribbean. I'm talking about myself as an extension, issues around Cuba, and most certainly the liberation struggle in Africa. Tom Bradley's heart was there, and by my being out there, I believed, and I saw myself as an extension not only of what I individually was doing, but what my mayor was supportive of. And my colleagues on the mayor were supportive of me that way. But it's like saying, don't get it twisted. I had the support of Tom Bradley and the things that I did, especially around the anti-apartheid struggles, and I was very, very proud to be out there in a way on point on those issues. I mean, that was just about the time. And remember, there was not the expectation of Negro public employees to get involved in controversial things. That was not part of the norm or the expectation of what you found in places of public employment. Wanda's kind, when she talks about just one aspect of her working at City Hall, the council offices were among the last places where you had Negro girls working. Well, what's that all about in contemporary Los Angeles in the 1950s, 60s, post-World War II? This segregation was still there. White supremacy may have manifested itself most actively and aggressively and openly in the police department, but this was local government in California. Los Angeles, remember, was a city where we had strong commitments to racially restrictive covenants, had strong commitments to segregation inside of the LA Unified School District. And in hindsight, although it was part of everyday life, at a particular point, many of us understood that we simply had to suck it up. And in many, many ways, Tom Bradley and other men and women of his generation sucked up a lot of stuff just to be able to go to work, to get a job in the police department in the first place. You hear stories of other men and women who chose to take a shot at getting a job at City Hall. And City Hall was a hard nut to crack, just to simply get a job to work in positions for which you were qualified. Mm-hmm. So there's a strong undercurrent of that, and unfortunately, as our film producers found out, there's not very much information out there about South LA. Why? The same Los Angeles Times that had no reporters of color of any kind to go out to cover 1965, the Watts Rebellion. They didn't have people to just go out and cover the nature of life in South Los Angeles because they didn't think it was important. So if the major newspaper felt that way, and they felt that way not only during the Bradley administration, but years later during the Bradley administration, when the guns came into South LA, when the cocaine came in from Central America, as we find out, sponsored by some people associated with a president of the United States at that time, all of a sudden, media people found out, oh my gosh, what's going on down there? And this community with this magnificent police department, with its extraordinary police intelligence, they missed it. And that's why a fellow by the name of Gary Webb did very, very well in breaking a story about the cocaine connection and how all of that stuff got dumped out in the South LA. And there was also a side comment about people at the Los Angeles Times being so upset that Gary Webb would come in and seek to earn a Pulitzer Prize for coverage of a major story on their backyards. They did not care about the coverage of us. Even today, the difficulty of this film, and you look into any resource about not just Tom Bradley, but a whole number of generations of people who've been active in the public sector and in social service activities in their own community in South LA, it's not there because they chose not to write about it. Not that it slipped by, they chose not to write about it. And if the Times felt that way, what do you think it was like for the other community newspapers and other influentials in Los Angeles in thinking about anything out of South LA? And then who would have believed that a citywide leader would rise out of South LA? And then police officer Tom Bradley, Lieutenant Tom Bradley, who did so well in the Rempar area when he got to be lieutenant and assigned there. And people discovered that there could be a black police officer, a lieutenant who could really be fair to white police officers in assigning them to work with Negroes in the same car and protecting all of the people of LA. Tom Bradley's story is a good story, but there's still a lot underneath that shows that Los Angeles was pretty much an American city post-World War II, and there was a lot of democracy that we talked about. World War II and right after was not being practiced here at all. But Tom changed that. People saw him in a different way, and he was competent, and he was capable, and he was, as he said, liberal on things that were social, and then on the financial side, because of course, who ever heard of a Negro managing money well? And lo and behold, Tom Bradley was able to run the city, and he was viewed as being an exception because he could do that. Just to show you how people perceived us who happened to be in the public sector, especially those who were elected. They were surprised that we could basically do our jobs. Once again, the perceptions of reality show up historically to be the realities of what Los Angeles were, because that's all that was reported, or look at the great amount of information that was not reported.
Now, of course, one of the major themes of the film is the coalitions,
Yes.
coalition building, and the depth and the width of the coalitions. They talked a lot about the various racial groups, the economic. One thing that wasn't mentioned, and maybe there just isn't a lot of information on, is how important were coalitions of women in what Bradley was able to build? Did that come up at all any time during the research and production?
Yes, there was some information that we found. I mean, probably Wanda would be better to talk about that. But I would just say that there are so many stories and so many details that are not in the film. I mean, it's really, we were constantly challenged by the length of the film, which is, we made it so it could be shown on PBS. And this is a PBS hour, which is 56 minutes and 46 seconds, and that's it. So it's, so often the stories, about, the stories about apartheid and divestiture were stories we wanted to tell. Stories about, the women's movement, and certainly women were an important part of every one of Bradley's coalitions. Women were up there to a degree that they hadn't been in city government before, but we weren't able to, that was one of the stories we weren't able to go in any depth in.
And just to give you a little context of kind of why, too, is when we began the journey, Lynn and I, put together a list of about 300 people to seek out, to try to find, so that we could start doing pre-interviews and collect and compile the research necessary to start shaping the story. We spent the first year and a half trying to locate these people, find them, doing pre-interviews. It came down to about 135 pre-interviews. We used that as our initial research to launch us into the 50 people that we wanted to interview for the actual film, which is what we did. Wanda and Councilman were obviously in the film, two of those 50 people. Out of those 50 people, 40 ended up in the film. In regards to that, we also did additional research. We have hundreds and hundreds of pages of primary and secondary research materials, hundreds of hours of footage, books, magazines. I mean, it was incredibly difficult to take all of this information and interweave it with the history of Los Angeles, with the themes of police brutality and race and racism and coalition building, and the history of and legacy of one man, and make it into a compelling, engaging, and historically accurate story in 57 minutes. So we had to make very intentional deliberate decisions as to what stories we could keep and what stories that we just could not cover, and which is why we have the bonus section in the back of the DVD. But there were times when Lynn and I, disagreed, and we had to come to that point where, we had to compromise, and it was, and in the end, I think we have a very good product. But it was the biggest challenge of this film.
Well, if I might, I want to just build on something and thank you all for referencing the first coalition, because it really was around Ed Roybal who showed that a coalition could be put together. It all started with Ed Roybal, this veteran, this man who came back to his city and who, on behalf of his community, expressed outrage at the fact that the Los Angeles Police Department didn't necessarily like what they call zoot suiters. That was mostly Mexican-American, a lot of black young people who would dress a particular way, given the times. And I think it was called Sleepy Lagoon, back over where Dodger Stadium is right now, that the police officers went in and just did a job on a number of young people of Mexican-American heritage, and it fired up Roybal, and he chose to run for election in the 9th District. And the 9th District at that time was a lot more mixed. There was a very, very strong, historic presence of Jewish community there. And the folks came together out of a sense of social justice and concern. And lo and behold, it was not just a Mexican-American standing up concerned about what the police department was doing, brutalizing people in their own community. He hit a nerve, and it fired up all of the folks in the 9th District. The 9th District at that time came into South LA and included that Avalon Carver Community Center where I mentioned to you. And Ed Roybal had been active as a social activist in those days, even in South LA. And that was the framework where you had these folks coming together. Jewish activists, community people, everyday men and women who lived in the communities. The few synagogue, I think there's one left, or a memorial on one left in East LA, but Breed Street, but there are about 4 in South LA. They're not there anymore. But that framework of people who were active and socially conscious came together. And in that Roybal campaign where he won, it showed the seeds for what came next. It was slow in coming, but he was the first to put it together. And to a certain extent, there are still remnants of that coalition alive and active today. But I want to just thank you all for including that in the Bradley piece, because it gave some reference and background to the fact that it was something that was just nascent out there, but it took the Tom Bradley piece to really elevate it to the place where that kind of mobilization could have an expression of people taking over their own city and running it in a collective way.
Okay, I'm going to open this one up to anyone who wants to answer it. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I hope we can still get a little bit of audience Q&A in. Now, of course, the time that Roybal and Bradley were in office with their careers, you didn't have term limits. And so coalitions and relationships could be built and maintained over a period of many years and decades, certainly. But now with term limits, is it possible for anyone to be able to do nowadays what Bradley was able to do between his council time and his time as mayor? Is there anyone who can see anybody doing that anymore? Is that possible? Does anybody want to take a crack?
Well, I'll cheat on this one. Yes, I think Eric Garcetti is doing a magnificent job. I think he's a guy, if anyone is going to rise to the level of prominence of Tom Bradley in terms of making a contribution to this city, it's going to be Eric Garcetti. The significant difference in terms of the time, Bradley was, I want to put this in context. I mean, I feel it. None of these beautiful ladies do, but I feel it. This is the 20th century, and the Tom Bradley story is the 21st century, and the Tom Bradley story is a 20th century story. The 21st century, we're through the first decade of it, almost through the second decade of it. Technology has changed, organizational structures have changed, the economy has changed. And in the brief time that he's been at City Hall, Eric Garcetti has been able to pull the city together with the use of technology, a massive capacity to manage data, to pull people together in a way comparable to what Tom Bradley and the coalition was able to do citywide back in the day when people were just using typewriters and telephones and a lot of public face-to-face meetings. Garcetti and his crew are, to me, extraordinarily capable in the way that they have melded the issues of the mayor's office with the priorities of the city as executed in the budget, with the collaboration of the Los Angeles City Council and an extraordinary number of civic players around this community. The passage of Proposition M with the MTA, the Triple H housing issue, basically had his leadership and his coalition committing people to go to the property tax to pay for important things in the city, housing for the homeless, and transportation. His victory just this past week on Proposition H provided money coming from the sales tax to deal with human services in the city and the county. I mean, it's almost like saying, if someone in Washington, D.C. was to say, you know, we in the federal government don't like Los Angeles anymore, I think the people in Los Angeles and public leadership now can say, well, you know what, Mr. President, and whoever else you might send out here, if need be, if we feel that something's important in LA, we'll pay for it ourselves, because we've shown that twice we've increased the property tax to deal with housing for the homeless and in dealing with transportation. And we just passed a sales tax on ourselves with a 10-year limit, 10 years, to deal with social services to make sure the homeless housing was taken care of. I think that if we're fortunate to have a sound local economy, we're going to show that this city is going to be really the lead city in the United States in terms of addressing the special needs of its people. Now, to me, that comes straight out of the Tom Bradley playbook. A different century, a different person, but using this same mechanism of the city council in Los Angeles, the mayor's office in LA, and the charter to bring this about. So in a way, you see it beginning to happen all over. This is Tom Bradley #2.
Interesting thought about that. Let's see. We do have time for a couple of questions. Unfortunately, the microphone is over there. I have to go retrieve that, so excuse me a second.
Say the other word.
I said, would you agree with me on that?
Diane, you want to?
Garcetti and his staff,
Can you handle
their capacity to do things using the technology was back in the day. I remember coming and seeing you and out there with cards.
Oh, yeah.
Cards, you know, you had to do it that way. You do it today, you hit a button, name come up,
Yeah.
stuff comes up.
Thank you all so much. I'm a docent here at this library, and of course we acknowledge Mr. Bradley. I'm a docent here at the library, and of course we acknowledge Tom Bradley with every tour. But I would like to know if any of you could give us an anecdote or any story that you could possibly remember from 1986 when we had the fire. Our information is that Bradley had requested that the fire department be aware and trained for the possibility of a fire here or in some of the other older buildings, and that had been referred to as the one reason why there was so little damage and no loss of life and no injury. So, you know, just out of curiosity, does anybody know a story that we could share?
Story to share.
I could share a story that Mayor Bradley was right here when the fire was here.
Hi,
And I could share a story, if this microphone works, that he had such great care that they were so impressed with his leadership that this wing behind here is named after the greatest mayor. And I love Eric Garcetti, but he's no Tom Bradley. Okay, okay? I didn't hear Wanda second it. I love Eric. I just want to say that. But he was very engaged, especially with young people, in getting them to the libraries. And when Bobby Farrell was talking earlier, you know, that when the Security Pacific Bank went out of business, they sent their archives over to this library. And it had nothing but white faces in all the pictures. So what did the librarians do here? Kathy Kabashi and Carolyn Cole went out to Angeles Mesa Library, went out to Ben Franklin over on the east side, Pacoima Library, and asked the families to bring in their albums. And they scanned the pictures. So after you leave here, go to the bookstore, buy Shades of LA. It's a great book that they do. I haven't seen a microphone in a long time, so I got to give it back real quick.
Thank you, Tom. Oh, Tom? Oh. For one or two you may not know, that was former Councilman Tom LaBonge.
1974 and 5. Thank you.
That's right.
Okay, okay.
That's right.
Hi, well, going on, piggybacking what your comment was regarding the textbooks and information about Tom Bradley, it just so happens that I was a panel of about 6 children in '71 at Hobart Boulevard School that got the opportunity to meet Tom Bradley and ask him questions. I don't think he was mayor at the time. He might have been a councilman, I'm not sure. But I went digging for that information because I don't have it, and it's just a memory. And I even had my school friends, they don't remember either. So I called Hobart Boulevard, and they don't even know anything about it. And I'm thinking, well, you don't have anything on Tom Bradley, that he was there at your school? And no, they don't. So I was sort of sad about that. I just thought you'd know, and you probably don't even know yourselves.
It's too late now.
Okay, we have time for one more.
I have a quick question for everybody. Looking at the film, you saw when Tom Bradley was running for governor in '80, and I'm just curious because we look back at the gun initiative. I'm curious about what was the relationship between Tom Bradley and the state Democratic Party, and how did the gun initiative get on the ballot, and how did it affect the election? That's for anybody up there.
I can't tell.
I think that that's another one of the stories that folks are even today reluctant to engage. Tom Bradley was elected mayor, served well, but you know, there were still limitations that people felt towards Tom Bradley, I believe. And I believe what you just addressed was one of those areas where Tom Bradley, as a Democratic leader running for governor, should have had the full support of all aspects of the Democratic Party in doing what they could to assure its victory. And at the same time, I believe that as these things are unraveling and coming back together even today, that there are people who feel that they want to put something on the ballot because they have their issue, and their issue is just as important as us electing a governor. And they had counsel to say, you know, that gun control issue should not be put on this ballot because we have a larger issue at stake. And there was some people who were just in their own arrogance, and they're still around, who basically said, to me, the hell with Tom Bradley getting to be elected governor. I want to make sure that my issue on gun control gets out there. And it did get out there. And an unintended consequence, they will say, was that, that the gun control issue didn't pass, nor did Tom Bradley get elected governor. Because when the folks out there got stirred up about somebody going to take my gun away and all the rest of that, they were not necessarily the men and women who were involved in political discourse about the future of the state in a partisan way, and they're going to turn out and go for the best person. That was something that was just tossed out there to tempt those folks to come out, because the gun control folks knew that that ballot measure wasn't going to pass, but they just had to put it on the ballot that time around. And unfortunately...
Name names, Robert. Name names.
No, Tom, I don't want to do that. But it's, you know, Tom acknowledges something, you know. We live in the world of politics. Sometimes there are people out there, they say they love you, and they say, hey, how much do you love me? Maybe not that much, because I'm going to get mine this time right away. And lo and behold, they didn't get theirs, and they hurt us in terms of what they engendered in terms of additional people going to the polls in areas of the state, and even perhaps around in Los Angeles County, where those people would have just been sitting back, not participating in the campaign at all, or maybe just looking at civic virtues until somebody said they want to do something and take away my right to have my gun. And I believe it was rude on their part. They hurt us. They hurt themselves. They hurt their issue. And for persons like myself of my generation, it's something that we're going to die hating those people for, even until today. They put their own single issue above the well-being of the people of the whole state. And remember, there's a reason why we have term limits in Los Angeles. It was because in this great state of California, there were some people who were just so upset by the success of Assembly Speaker Willie Brown and the fact that he was successful in mobilizing through his leadership, leading not only Democrats and Republicans in the Assembly, that they basically put on term limits as an issue to get rid of Willie Brown. And up and down the state, the issue of term limits was not fought on the basis of, well, you know, people should have an opportunity to get different faces to run. In some places in this state of California, term limits was about getting rid of Willie Brown. And once again, maybe sometime in history, someone's going to write about that and say that's the only reason folks put out that money and mounted that campaign, because when they took out Willie Brown, they took out a lot of people who were favorable to their points of view. Democrats and Republicans, people of all political suasions, they're all affected. But some said it is worth everybody coming out, but we got to get him out. Anecdote? I don't know. Term limits passed, and there's been a trickle down, and many say that it's disadvantageous. It's a new discipline that we all must face in the state of California, that there are term limits. But it's not the sexy civic enterprise, the need for democracy role. Don't buy that kind of stuff. Because, well, no, I won't get into that, because now that we have another proposition that's passed, you may be able to go out and buy something on the street, and you might think it's something, and it might not be what you think you're going to be buying. And, you know, you go for that. But that's the other part. Tom Bradley overcame so much racist practice that we often forget about it, or we choose not to talk about it, because it's an ugly side of American life. It's an ugly side of California life. It's an ugly side of Los Angeles life. But we have been able generally to overcome that. But that is one piece that will always be out there as an indication of how some people are going for their own personal interest in thinking that they can do something politically, really damaging an opportunity for the best qualified man we had at that time to be governor of the state of California, have him not get it.
All right, well, I want to thank our panel for coming out and telling us about the film and what they know about Bradley, and I hope that if you have a couple of minutes to chat with them afterwards, I hope they'll make themselves available to you for that. 3 weeks from today, we are going to be doing the next Marie Northrop lecture. It's going to be focusing on the unrest of 1992 that ironically kind of ended the film and Tom Bradley's time in office. It was actually the low point, I would say. And so to that, we're going to have screen some more material. We're going to have another panel. And one of those panelists actually showed up in this film. She is actually here, Marcia Chu, and I'm looking forward to having you on the stage. And we'll discuss that and other things. And I hope you'll come out and join us. So that'll be 3 weeks from today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.